In today's video, we're discussing the topic of colorblind racism. What is colorblind racism, you might be asking yourself? Well, we're all aware of what racism is. It's the kind we typically associate with pre-civil rights America, back when there was still segregation and minorities were considered second-class citizens. The truth of the matter is, though, racism is still at large today, but it exists in a more modern form, one that is not so easily to detect. This is where colorblind racism comes in, a facet of new racism, a concept put forth by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. So what does it mean to be racially colorblind? You might hear people say that they could never be racist because they don't see color or they don't see race.
Call me crazy, but I just don't see race.
This is a perfect example of how colorblind racism starts. At its core, it's a racial ideology that rationalizes or ignores racial inequality using non-racial language. So wait, I thought not seeing race was a good thing. It means no racism, all races are one race, the human race. So what's so bad about being colorblind? Well, even though the statement often comes from a good place, it ultimately allows people to remain blind towards racial issues that are still at large today, ultimately becoming a part of the bigger problem. One example where this is still seen today in modern America is with segregation. You might be saying segregation is a thing of the past, but there are still a vast amount of neighborhoods that are just solely white or Latino or black or any other ethnic group. In DC, 71% of black students attend schools with 0 white students. Plus, the Department of Housing and Urban Development did a study, and they found minority renters were showing up to 20% fewer units than white renters. There are no laws that permit segregation, so why does it still happen? Well, it's because we let it. People will justify segregated neighborhoods and schools with statements like, oh, people just like to be with their own kind, or likeliness gravitates toward likeliness. This is an example of naturalization, explaining away racial dynamics as natural or normal. Colorblind racism uses liberal ideas such as freedom of choice to explain away racial inequality while ignoring the factors that create and perpetuate the inequality in the first place. The second facet of colorblind racism is that of cultural racism. It's a concept that has been applied to prejudices and discrimination based on cultural differences between ethnic or racial groups. Basically, it's the validation of racist feelings by citing a person's culture as the issue, and not the race. There are 2 big examples of cultural racism happening in our world today, both of which have been proposed by our current president, Mr. Trump. The building of the border wall along the Mexican border, as well as the ban on travel from certain Islamic countries, are 2 very racist political proposals, but both of which are validated with cultural racism. If you're an American citizen, or just a human in the world with access to the internet, there's no doubt you've heard Mr. Donald Trump's statements about how all Mexicans are criminals, rapists, and job stealers.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
But it's just their culture, and he is not racist. And yet, MSNBC managed to come up with 16 minutes of airtime to dissect the history of our president's racist remarks.
Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here?
No, I'm not a racist. I am the least racist person you have ever interviewed. That I can tell you.
Even the Ku Klux Klan, perhaps the most well-known white supremacist group, at one point claimed they weren't racist on the basis of colorblindness. In 2006, a spokesperson for the group claimed that they were not racist, they actually just wanted true equality, which race-based affirmative action programs get in the way of. They argue against race-based affirmative action programs on the basis of colorblindness, saying it gives minorities an unfair advantage. Another study done in 2012 demonstrated the need for African American parents to speak to their kids about what it means to be black, not just for identity purposes, but for safety, and what to expect in life as an African American in the U.S. When the same question was posed to white parents, whether or not they had to speak to their kids on what it means to be white, participants didn't even understand the question. Minorities can't afford to be colorblind, as their very lives are driven by the systemic racism that affects them and still exists today. Whites, on the other hand, are safe from this, and don't see it because they don't need to. The same study showed that, despite whites claiming they are all for individual expression and celebration of one's race, whites immediately began to view this individual expression as racist, when it turned from celebration to a political movement.
That's anti-American and it's racist.
One major example in today's world is the Black Lives Matter movement. This movement, and others like it, socially isolate the white population from minorities, and in doing so, ultimately draws attention to racial issues whites so badly want to ignore, and is a threat to the colorblind narrative that allows whites to feel safe from guilt.
I am not a racist. I don't even see race.
Whenever you catch a friend using terms like these, remind them how it can actually be dangerous in perpetuating racism in today's world. When people say things like, that's just the way things are, when referring to systemic racism, you'll know they are using a form of naturalization. Or when people like Mr. President Trump use statements like, "It's just how their culture is," to justify being racist, you'll know this is an example of cultural racism at work. The fact of the matter is, racial colorblind narratives allow the terrible systemic racism in America to continue. Even though you may think ignoring the social differences that exist between whites and minorities is one way to diffuse the tension, it actually gives systemic racism the go-ahead to continue on. The many issues today, like segregation in schools and neighborhoods, lesser job opportunities, unequal pay, and so many others, are perpetuated by the colorblind narratives white individuals continue to use and operate under.
I guess I'm just the least racist person here.
Okay. Race is often a pretty obvious thing to observe. It's not racist to notice.
I had to laugh. Zach, my goodness, I only see one race.
Ugh.
The human race.
Such bullshit.